The fluorescent lights of Ironhaven Fitness buzzed overhead as Mia Rodriguez pushed through the glass doors, her gym bag slung over her shoulder and determination etched across her face. What happened in the next 30 minutes would shatter everything she thought she knew about strength, and by the time the dust settled, 5 bullies would be lying on the rubber matting, staring up at a woman they'd gravely underestimated. But Mia had no idea that her ordinary Tuesday evening workout was about to become a life-changing encounter with a decorated Navy SEAL who would transform her from victim to warrior. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October air in Riverstone, Colorado, carried the crisp promise of winter as Mia stepped into the 24-hour gym at 9:30 p.m. She'd deliberately chosen this late hour to avoid the crowds, the judgment, and most importantly, the group of 5 men who'd been making her life miserable for the past 3 weeks. At 5'4" and 125 pounds, Mia looked like an easy target to those who confused size with strength. What they didn't know was that she'd grown up as the daughter of a single mother who'd taught her that backing down was never an option. The gym was nearly empty, except for a few dedicated late-night lifters scattered across the sprawling 15,000-square-foot facility. Mia made her way to the women's section, a smaller area tucked behind the main weight room that featured lighter dumbbells and cardio equipment. She'd been a regular at Ironhaven for 8 months, ever since moving to Riverstone to start her new job as a software engineer at Mountain Tech Solutions. The gym had become her sanctuary, the one place where she could clear her head after long days of coding and debugging. But her sanctuary had been violated 3 weeks ago when Derek Vaughn and his crew decided she didn't belong. Derek was everything Mia despised about toxic gym culture: 6'2", 220 pounds of muscle, built more for intimidation than function. He held court in the main weight room like a territorial gorilla. His followers, Jake Morrison, the wannabe influencer with perfectly styled hair and zero personality; Troy Blackstone, whose neck was thicker than most people's thighs; Ryan Cross, who compensated for his insecurities by picking on anyone smaller than him; and Pete Rollins, who just went along with whatever the group decided, had turned bullying into an art form. It started with comments. "Hey, princess, you sure you can handle those 10-pound weights?" Then escalated to blocking her access to equipment. "Sorry, we're using this bench." All 5 of them. For the next hour. Last week they'd crossed a line by following her to the parking lot, surrounding her car and suggesting she'd be more comfortable at one of those cute little yoga studios downtown. Mia had filed complaints with gym management, but the owner, Gary Helms, was more interested in keeping his biggest spenders happy than protecting a single female member. "Boys will be boys," he'd shrugged when she showed him the video of them blocking her from the squat rack. "Maybe try coming during different hours." Tonight, Mia had thought she was safe. 9:30 p.m. was usually dead, and she'd seen Derek's oversized truck absent from the parking lot. She set down her bag near the women's section and began her warm-up routine. 5 minutes on the elliptical to get her blood flowing. Her plan was simple: 30 minutes of strength training focusing on her shoulders and back, then home to her small apartment overlooking the Riverstone Creek. She was 15 minutes into her workout, positioned at the cable machine working on lat pull-downs, when she heard the familiar sound of aggressive laughter echoing from the main gym. Her stomach dropped. Through the mirror, she could see them entering like a pack of hyenas who'd caught the scent of prey. Derek led the group, his eyes scanning the gym until they locked onto Mia's reflection. A predatory smile spread across his face as he nudged Jake Morrison and pointed in her direction. The 5 of them began moving toward the women's section, with the casual confidence of people who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. Mia tried to ignore them, focusing on her form as she completed another set of pull-downs. Maybe they'd just make their usual comments and move on. Maybe tonight would be different. But as their footsteps grew closer and their voices louder, she realized this confrontation was going to be worse than anything that had come before. "Well, well, well," Derek's voice carried across the near-empty gym like a threat. "Look what we have here, boys. Little Mia still thinks she belongs in a real gym." The 5 men formed a loose semicircle around her, cutting off her easy escape routes toward the main exit. It was a practiced formation, clearly not their first time cornering someone. Derek positioned himself directly in front of the cable machine, while his followers spread out to block her peripheral vision. "We've been talking," Derek continued, his voice taking on a mock, reasonable tone that somehow felt more menacing than outright aggression. "And we've decided you'd be happier somewhere else. This is a serious training facility for serious athletes, not a place for—" He gestured dismissively at her setup, "whatever this is supposed to be." Mia's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "I have every right to be here. I pay my membership fees just like everyone else." Troy Blackstone laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Rights? Princess, this isn't about rights. This is about respect. Respect for people who've earned their place here through years of dedication and hard work. While you," Ryan Cross added, stepping closer, "are just taking up space and equipment that real athletes need." The situation was escalating beyond verbal intimidation. Pete Rollins had moved to block the path to the women's locker room, while Jake Morrison positioned himself near the emergency exit. They weren't just trying to humiliate her anymore. They were trapping her. What none of them noticed was the figure who had been quietly working out in the far corner of the gym. Commander Sarah Phoenix Mitchell, recently returned from a classified operation in the South China Sea, had been using the late-night hours at Ironhaven to decompress and maintain her physical conditioning during her mandated leave. At 32 years old, with 11 years in naval special operations and 3 combat deployments that had earned her a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a reputation as one of the most lethal operators in her unit, Sarah had developed a keen sense for predatory behavior. She'd been watching the situation develop while maintaining her workout routine, her trained eyes cataloging escape routes, threat assessments, and tactical options. What she saw was 5 men using classic intimidation tactics against a young woman who was clearly in distress, but trying not to show it. Sarah had seen this pattern before in different contexts and different countries. Bullies were bullies, whether they wore enemy uniforms or gym clothes. The tactics were always the same: isolate the target, overwhelm with numbers, use size and aggression to create compliance through fear. But what these 5 men didn't understand was that they'd just made their biggest mistake, because Sarah Mitchell had spent her entire adult life dealing with people who thought they could intimidate others through superior force, and she had very specific opinions about men who cornered women in dark places. As Derek reached out his hand toward Mia's shoulder, clearly intending to physically move her away from the equipment, Sarah made her decision. She set down her weights with deliberate precision, stood up from the bench where she'd been working, and began walking toward the women's section. Her approach was silent, controlled, and carried the kind of presence that made seasoned operators nervous. But Derek and his crew were too focused on their victim to notice the storm approaching from behind. What happened next would become legendary at Ironhaven Fitness, replayed in whispered conversations and cell phone videos that would go viral within hours. Because in 30 seconds, 5 bullies were about to learn the difference between looking strong and being strong. And Mia Rodriguez was about to discover that sometimes help arrives from the most unexpected places, wearing the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced real monsters in real wars and lived to teach others how to do the same. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, but everything else in Ironhaven Fitness was about to change forever. Commander Sarah Phoenix Mitchell had learned to read situations within seconds of entering a room. A skill honed through 11 years of naval special operations where hesitation meant death. As she observed the confrontation unfolding in the women's section of Ironhaven Fitness, her tactical mind was already 3 steps ahead, cataloging threats, assessing capabilities, and identifying the most efficient way to neutralize what she recognized as a textbook predatory scenario. Sarah had arrived at Riverstone, Colorado 3 weeks ago on mandatory psychological leave following Operation Neptune's Trident, a classified mission in the South China Sea that had gone sideways faster than anyone could have predicted. The official report would remain buried in Pentagon files for the next 30 years, but the scars Sarah carried told a different story. She'd lost 2 teammates in that operation, Lieutenant Commander James Reaper Torres and Petty Officer First Class Amanda Ghost Thompson, and despite the commendations that followed, she'd requested time away from active duty to process what military psychologists euphemistically called operational stress. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sarah Mitchell, who'd infiltrated terrorist strongholds in Afghanistan, eliminated high-value targets in Syria, and survived a week behind enemy lines in Somalia with nothing but a combat knife and her training, was struggling to adapt to civilian life in a quiet Colorado mountain town. The transition from life-or-death decisions to choosing between brands of cereal at the local grocery store had proven more challenging than any combat mission she'd ever undertaken. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, the Navy psychiatrist overseeing her leave, had been clear about the requirements. 6 months of civilian integration, Commander. No contact with your unit, no classified briefings, no mission planning. You need to remember what it feels like to be human again, not just a weapon pointed at America's enemies. Sarah had chosen Riverstone specifically because it was everything her military life wasn't. Population 8,400, nestled in a valley surrounded by the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, where the biggest emergency was usually a tourist getting lost on hiking trails. She'd rented a small cabin on Willow Creek Road 20 minutes from downtown, where she could maintain her physical conditioning while staying invisible to the locals who might ask too many questions about her background. Ironhaven Fitness had become her anchor point, the one place where she could maintain some semblance of her previous routine. She'd chosen the late-night hours deliberately. Fewer people meant fewer interactions, fewer chances for someone to notice the way she automatically assessed entry and exit points, or how she positioned herself with clear sightlines to all potential threats. Old habits from a life where paranoia was a survival skill. But as she watched Derek Vaughn and his crew corner Mia Rodriguez, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Torres and Thompson died. Purpose. Not the manufactured purpose of training exercises or the abstract purpose of national security, but the immediate, concrete purpose of protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. Sarah's file, if anyone had clearance to read it, told the story of a warrior forged in the crucible of post-9/11 warfare. Born in Tucson, Arizona, to a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, Sarah had joined the Navy at 18 with nothing but determination and a burning desire to serve something larger than herself. She'd excelled in every training program they'd thrown at her, from basic seamanship to advanced combat tactics, earning her way into the most elite units through sheer competence and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been earned during her second deployment to Afghanistan when her unit was ambushed in the Korangal Valley. An IED had destroyed their convoy, killing 3 Marines and leaving Sarah trapped under a burning Humvee with both legs broken and shrapnel in her shoulder. Instead of waiting for rescue, she'd used a piece of the wreckage as a lever to free herself, then carried 2 wounded teammates to safety while laying down suppressing fire with her sidearm. The citation for her Silver Star mentioned her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty. But Sarah remembered it differently. She remembered the smell of burning fuel, the weight of Corporal Martinez as she dragged him to cover, and the absolute certainty that dying in that valley was not an option. That night had taught her something that no amount of training could replicate. In the moments when everything falls apart, when all the plans fail and the equipment breaks and the situation goes to hell, what matters isn't strength or speed or even skill. What matters is the decision to keep fighting when every rational instinct tells you to quit. Now, watching 5 grown men intimidate a young woman in a public place, Sarah felt that same crystalline clarity descending over her. This wasn't Afghanistan, and these weren't enemy combatants, but the fundamental equation was identical. Predators had identified prey, and they were counting on fear and isolation to achieve their objectives. The tactical assessment was straightforward. Derek Vaughn, the obvious leader, was large but moved with the sluggish confidence of someone who'd never faced real resistance. Jake Morrison, Troy Blackstone, Ryan Cross, and Pete Rollins were followers, dangerous in a group but likely to fold individually once their leader was neutralized. None of them showed signs of formal training, relying instead on size and numbers to overwhelm their target. More importantly, none of them had noticed her approach. They were so focused on their victim that they'd completely ignored their tactical environment, a mistake that would have gotten them killed in any real combat situation. Sarah found herself almost disappointed by their amateur-hour intimidation techniques. If you're going to be predators, she thought grimly, at least be competent predators. But Sarah's intervention wasn't going to be about demonstrating superior combat skills or embarrassing 5 bullies in front of their victim. Those were secondary objectives. Her primary mission was something more complex and infinitely more important. She was going to teach Mia Rodriguez that she didn't have to be a victim. Sarah had spent years training elite operators, turning raw recruits into weapons capable of functioning in the world's most dangerous places. But she'd never tried to train a civilian, someone without the military framework that made warriors out of ordinary people. This would be different. This would require not just tactical knowledge, but the ability to instill confidence and capability in someone who'd never imagined herself as anything other than vulnerable. As she closed the distance to the confrontation, Sarah's mind was already formulating a training plan. Mia Rodriguez was about to become her first civilian student, whether she knew it or not. And Derek Vaughn and his crew were about to become unwilling participants in a lesson about the difference between appearing strong and actually being strong. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the rubber gym mats. In 30 seconds, those shadows would hide the swift, brutal education of 5 men who'd mistaken predation for power. But more importantly, those same shadows would witness the birth of something Sarah had thought she'd lost in the mountains of Afghanistan. A sense of mission, a reason to teach, and maybe, just maybe, a way forward that didn't involve constantly looking backward at teammates who would never come home. Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, was about to rise from the ashes of her own trauma by teaching someone else to do the same. The only question was whether Mia Rodriguez was ready to learn what it meant to fight back. The moment Derek's hand reached toward Mia's shoulder, intending to physically force her away from the cable machine, Sarah stepped out of the shadows with the silent precision of someone who'd spent years moving through hostile territory undetected. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, calm and controlled, carrying an undertone that made experienced soldiers nervous. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The 5 men turned toward the voice, their formation breaking slightly as they registered the presence of someone they hadn't noticed approaching. Sarah stood 15 feet away, her posture relaxed but somehow commanding attention. At 5'7", with an athletic build that spoke of functional strength rather than gym vanity, she didn't look particularly intimidating to men accustomed to using size as their primary weapon. Derek recovered first, his predatory smile returning as he sized up this new variable. "Lady, this doesn't concern you. We're having a private conversation with our friend here." His tone carried the dismissive confidence of someone who'd never been challenged by a woman half his size. Sarah took 3 measured steps closer, her movement fluid and purposeful. "Your friend seems uncomfortable with this conversation. Maybe it's time to find someone else to talk to." Her voice remained level, but there was something in her delivery that made Jake Morrison unconsciously step backward. "Listen, sweetheart," Troy Blackstone interjected, his thick neck flushing red with irritation. "Why don't you mind your own business before you get yourself in trouble? This is between us and the princess here." Mia watched the exchange with growing confusion and fear. This unknown woman was putting herself in danger on her behalf, but against 5 men the odds seemed impossible. "Please," Mia said quietly, "you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off Derek. Her voice carried absolute certainty, the kind of conviction that came from facing down actual monsters in places where civilization was just a memory. "Because what's happening here isn't acceptable." Ryan Cross laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Not acceptable? Lady, you're about to learn what's not acceptable. 5 against 1 isn't great odds for you." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her stance, so subtle that only someone with military training would have noticed. Her weight redistributed slightly onto the balls of her feet, her hands loosened at her sides, and her breathing became controlled and rhythmic. She was preparing for combat with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done it countless times before. 5 against 1, Sarah repeated thoughtfully, as if considering the mathematics. "You're right. Those aren't great odds." She paused, her gray eyes meeting Derek's with unsettling directness. "For you." Derek's smile faltered slightly. There was something in this woman's demeanor that didn't match her size or apparent vulnerability. She wasn't backing down, wasn't showing fear, wasn't even raising her voice. Instead, she stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced much worse than 5 gym bullies and lived to tell about it. "Derek," Pete Rollins said nervously, "maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Pete," Derek snapped, his attention still focused on Sarah. "Lady, I'm going to give you one chance to walk away. Turn around, go back to whatever cardio machine you were using, and pretend you never saw anything. Because if you don't, things are going to get very unpleasant for you." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his offer. "That's generous," she said, "but I have a counter-proposal. You 5 gentlemen are going to apologize to Ms. Rodriguez for your behavior. You're going to leave her alone permanently, and you're going to walk out of this gym with your dignity intact. Because if you don't, I'm going to teach you something about respect that you apparently never learned." The absurdity of a woman their size threatening 5 grown men seemed to break something in Troy's restraint. "That's it," he snarled, stepping toward Sarah with his massive fists clenched. "I'm done listening to this crazy—" What happened next unfolded with the swift, brutal efficiency of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of violence. Troy's charge was aggressive but clumsy, relying on size and momentum rather than technique. Sarah sidestepped his approach with minimal movement, her right hand snapping out to strike a specific pressure point at the base of his neck while her left found his wrist. The nerve strike dropped Troy to his knees instantly, his entire right arm going numb as neural pathways shut down. Before the others could react, Sarah had pivoted, using Troy's falling body as a fulcrum to leverage herself into position for her next target. Jake Morrison tried to grab her from behind, a tactical mistake that demonstrated his complete lack of combat training. Sarah felt his approach, ducked under his reaching arms, and drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The strike hit the nerve cluster just below his sternum, paralyzing his diaphragm and sending him gasping to the floor beside Troy. Ryan Cross and Pete Rollins rushed her simultaneously from different angles, finally showing some tactical awareness. Sarah dropped into a crouch, swept Pete's legs out from under him with her right leg, while simultaneously blocking Ryan's punch with her forearm. As Pete fell, she grabbed his wrist and used his momentum to throw him into Ryan, sending both men crashing into the cable machine with a sound that echoed through the gym. 15 seconds. 4 men on the ground, gasping and disoriented. Derek stood frozen, his brain struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. The woman who'd seemed so vulnerable moments before had just dismantled his crew, with movements so fast and precise they barely registered as violence. It looked more like a choreographed dance than a fight. "Your turn," Sarah said quietly, straightening up and facing Derek directly. Her breathing was completely normal, as if she'd been discussing the weather rather than neutralizing 4 attackers in rapid succession. "You can join your friends on the floor, or you can make a better choice." Derek's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Behind him, Troy was struggling to regain feeling in his arm. Jake was still fighting to breathe normally, and Ryan and Pete were untangling themselves from the wreckage of the cable machine. The entire foundation of Derek's worldview, that size and aggression trumped everything else, had just been shattered by a woman who looked like she should be teaching yoga classes. Mia stared in shock at the scene unfolding before her. The 5 men who'd terrorized her for weeks had been reduced to groaning casualties by someone who moved with the fluid grace of a professional dancer and the lethal precision of a weapon. But more than the physical demonstration, she was struck by something else: Sarah's complete calm throughout the encounter. There had been no anger, no dramatic pronouncements, just efficient problem-solving applied to human obstacles. "How?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the defeated bullies. Sarah glanced at her briefly, then returned her attention to Derek, who was backing away with his hands raised in surrender. "Training," she said simply. "Lots and lots of training." Derek found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. What are you?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked almost human rather than like some kind of tactical machine. "I'm someone who's tired of watching predators hunt prey," she said. "And I'm someone who's about to teach your friend here that she doesn't have to be prey anymore." She turned to face Mia directly, and her voice carried a different quality now. Not the controlled menace she'd used with Derek, but something warmer and more encouraging. "If you're interested in learning how to handle situations like this yourself, I'm offering lessons, real training, not the kind of self-defense class that teaches you to carry your keys between your fingers." Mia looked around at the 5 men who'd made her life miserable, now reduced to defeated casualties scattered across the gym floor. The fear that had dominated her existence for weeks was still there, but it was being replaced by something else. Curiosity, hope, and maybe, just maybe, the first stirring of anger at having been made to feel helpless for so long. "What kind of training?" she asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "The kind that means you'll never have to depend on someone else to save you." The silence that followed Sarah's offer hung in the air like smoke after a firefight. Derek Vaughn and his crew were slowly picking themselves up, off the gym floor, their earlier bravado replaced by confusion and wounded pride. Troy flexed his fingers experimentally, trying to restore feeling to his arm, while Jake still wheezed from the precise strike to his solar plexus. None of them made eye contact with Sarah or Mia as they gathered their scattered belongings with the defeated shuffle of men who discovered their limitations in the most humiliating way possible. Gary Helms, the gym owner, appeared from his office behind the front desk, drawn by the commotion. His expression shifted rapidly from annoyance to concern as he took in the scene. 5 of his most profitable members looking like they'd been hit by a truck, and 2 women standing calmly amid the wreckage. Sarah noted his approach with the peripheral awareness of someone trained to track multiple variables simultaneously. "What the hell happened here?" Gary demanded, his voice carrying the authority of property ownership. His eyes moved between the damaged cable machine and Derek's crew, clearly trying to calculate liability and lost revenue. "Derek, you guys okay? Do I need to call paramedics?" Derek straightened his shoulders, attempting to salvage some dignity from the disaster. "We're fine," he muttered, not looking at Sarah. "Just a misunderstanding that got out of hand." Sarah stepped forward, her posture shifting into what military personnel would recognize as parade rest, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind her back, spine straight. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. "Mr. Helms, I assume," she said, having noted his name embroidered on his polo shirt. These 5 gentlemen were engaging in harassment and intimidation behavior toward Ms. Rodriguez. When asked politely to cease their actions, they chose to escalate to physical threats. I intervened to de-escalate the situation. Gary's face flushed red as he processed the implications. A harassment incident on his property could mean lawsuits, bad publicity, and potential liability issues with his insurance company. "Look, I don't know what happened here, but—" "I have security footage," Sarah interrupted smoothly, gesturing toward the cameras mounted in the corners of the gym. "I'm certain it will clearly show who initiated physical contact and who was defending themselves and others." The blood drained from Gary's face as he realized the legal minefield he was standing in. Derek and his crew were significant sources of revenue between their memberships, personal training fees, and supplement purchases. They probably contributed close to $15,000 annually to his bottom line. But harassment lawsuits could cost him his business entirely. Mia watched this exchange with growing amazement. Not only had Sarah effortlessly neutralized 5 aggressive men, but she was now handling the political aftermath with the same calm competence. This wasn't just physical capability. It was a complete mastery of crisis management that spoke to training and experience far beyond civilian self-defense classes. "Perhaps," Sarah continued, her tone reasonable but implacable, "it would be beneficial for everyone if Mr. Vaughn and his associates found alternative fitness facilities that better suited their social needs. Ms. Rodriguez, on the other hand, is clearly committed to legitimate training and deserves an environment where she can pursue her fitness goals without harassment." Derek's face darkened, but he kept his mouth shut. Whatever this woman was, cop, soldier, martial arts instructor, she'd demonstrated capabilities that made any further confrontation inadvisable. Troy and the others were already edging toward the exit, eager to escape before their humiliation became more public. Gary nodded quickly, seizing the offered solution. Of course, I'll review their memberships and handle this appropriately." He turned to Derek with obvious reluctance. "Derek, maybe you guys should call it a night. We'll talk tomorrow about arrangements." The dismissal was clear. Derek's crew filed out of the gym with the sullen resentment of bullies who'd discovered they weren't as tough as they'd believed. As the glass doors closed behind them, the tension in the air dissipated, like pressure being released from a sealed container. Gary hurried back to his office, muttering about incident reports and insurance calls, leaving Sarah and Mia alone in the suddenly peaceful gym. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the same harsh illumination as before, but everything felt different now. The space that had been contaminated by fear and intimidation was slowly returning to its intended purpose, a place where people came to improve themselves. Mia looked at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity that bordered on awe. "Thank you," she said simply, then paused. "But I still don't understand. How did you do that? It looked like you barely touched them, but they went down like you'd hit them with a baseball bat." Sarah moved to a nearby bench and gestured for Mia to join her. When she spoke, her voice took on the patient tone of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to novices. What you saw wasn't magic or superhuman strength. It was applied anatomy and physics. Every human body has vulnerable points, nerve clusters, pressure points, balance points that can be exploited if you know where they are and how to access them. She held up her hands, studying them as if seeing them for the first time. Troy charged me like an angry bull, all momentum and no technique. I redirected his energy while simultaneously disrupting the nerve pathway that controls his right arm. He wasn't unconscious or seriously injured, just temporarily unable to coordinate his movements. Mia shook her head in amazement. "You make it sound like a science experiment." "It is in a way," Sarah replied. "Combat is applied physics, biology, and psychology. The person who understands those principles will always have an advantage over someone who relies purely on size or aggression." She turned to face Mia directly. "The question is whether you're interested in learning those principles yourself." The offer hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water. Mia had spent her entire life accepting vulnerability as an unchangeable fact, the price of being small in a world designed for larger, more aggressive people. The idea that she could transform from prey to predator seemed both thrilling and terrifying. "What would that involve?" Mia asked carefully. "I mean, I've never been in a fight in my life. I don't even like watching action movies because the violence makes me uncomfortable." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked approachable rather than intimidating. "That's actually an advantage. You don't have bad habits to unlearn or false confidence to overcome. We'd start with basics, situational awareness, defensive positioning, basic escapes from common grab attempts. The goal isn't to turn you into a Navy SEAL overnight. It's to give you options when someone tries to make you feel powerless." The mention of Navy SEALs made Mia's eyes widen. Were you actually— 11 years active duty," Sarah confirmed. 3 combat deployments, more training than I care to remember, and enough real-world experience to know the difference between gym violence and actual survival skills. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm on leave right now, dealing with some personal issues related to my service. Teaching you might be as beneficial for me as it would be for you." Mia considered this revelation. The woman sitting beside her wasn't just skilled. She was a professional warrior, someone who'd faced genuine life-or-death situations and emerged victorious. The idea that such a person would offer to share her knowledge was both humbling and empowering. "When would we start?" Mia asked, surprised by her own decisiveness. Sarah checked her watch, a military-issue timepiece designed for precision under extreme conditions. "Tomorrow evening, same time, but we'll use the functional training area in the back. It's more private, and the equipment is better suited for what I want to teach you." She stood and extended her hand. Fair warning, this won't be easy. Real self-defense training is physically and mentally demanding. But if you're committed to learning, I'm committed to teaching. Mia took her hand, feeling the calloused grip of someone whose hands were tools rather than accessories. I'm committed, she said, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in years. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Sarah made one final observation. Those 5 men will probably never bother you again. Word will spread about what happened tonight, and bullies generally prefer easier targets. But the real victory won't be their absence. It'll be knowing that you don't need me or anyone else to handle situations like this. Walking toward the exit, Mia felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the excitement of beginning an adventure whose outcome was completely uncertain. Tomorrow night, her real education would begin. The next evening arrived with the crisp bite of a Colorado October, and Mia found herself standing outside Ironhaven Fitness at exactly 9:30 p.m., her hands trembling slightly from a combination of cold air and nervous anticipation. She'd spent the entire day at Mountain Tech Solutions, unable to concentrate on code debugging, her mind constantly replaying the previous night's events and wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The rational part of her brain insisted that learning self-defense from a decorated Navy SEAL was the opportunity of a lifetime. The anxious part whispered that she was about to embarrass herself in front of someone who could probably kill people with her pinky finger. Sarah was already inside, having arrived early to set up the functional training area according to her specific requirements. She'd moved the adjustable benches to create clear sight lines, positioned crash mats at strategic intervals, and arranged various pieces of equipment in patterns that would allow for dynamic movement exercises. This wasn't going to be a typical civilian self-defense class featuring ineffective wrist grabs and unrealistic scenarios. This was going to be real training, adapted from methods she'd used to prepare special operations personnel for life-or-death situations. When Mia entered the gym, she immediately noticed the transformation of the functional training area. What had been a chaotic collection of exercise equipment now resembled something closer to a military training facility. Sarah stood in the center of the space wearing black athletic pants and a fitted gray tank top that revealed arms corded with functional muscle rather than the bulky mass favored by bodybuilders. Her posture was relaxed but alert, like a predator at rest but ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Punctual, Sarah observed approvingly as Mia approached. That's a good start. In the military, we say that being on time is being late, and being early is being on time. She gestured to the arranged equipment. Before we begin any physical training, we need to establish some ground rules and expectations. Mia set down her gym bag and looked around nervously. This looks way more intense than I was expecting. Are you sure I'm ready for something like this? Sarah's expression softened slightly, recognizing the genuine anxiety in Mia's voice. The setup looks intimidating because I believe in training the way you'll need to perform. But we're going to start with absolute basics and build slowly. The question isn't whether you're ready, it's whether you're willing to be uncomfortable while you learn. She moved to a nearby whiteboard that she'd somehow procured and began writing in the precise block letters favored by military instructors. First principle, situational awareness. Most violent encounters can be avoided entirely if you recognize and respond to warning signs before they escalate to physical confrontation. Mia pulled out her phone to take notes, but Sarah shook her head. No phones during training. This information needs to be internalized, not just recorded. Your phone won't be available when someone corners you in a parking lot. The correction stung slightly, but Mia recognized the logic. She put her phone away and focused on the whiteboard, where Sarah was outlining what she called the awareness pyramid. Level 1, baseline awareness. This means knowing what normal looks like in any environment, so you can identify abnormal behavior. Level 2, focused awareness. When something doesn't feel right, you shift into active observation mode. Level 3, tactical awareness. When you've identified a specific threat, you begin planning responses while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Sarah turned from the whiteboard to face Mia directly. Last night, those 5 men demonstrated classic predatory behavior. They selected an isolated target, used numerical superiority to create intimidation, and gradually escalated their aggression while testing for resistance. If you'd recognized the pattern earlier, you could have repositioned yourself to a more public area or requested assistance from gym staff before the situation reached critical mass. The analysis made Mia feel slightly foolish. I did notice them when they came in, but I just hoped they'd leave me alone if I ignored them. Hope is not a strategy, Sarah replied without condemnation. Predators interpret lack of response as weakness rather than disinterest. They're looking for victims who won't fight back, and passive behavior confirms their target selection. She moved to the crash mats. But recognizing the problem is just the first step. You also need to know what to do when recognition and avoidance aren't sufficient. Sarah knelt on one of the mats and gestured for Mia to join her. We're going to start with basic body mechanics. The human body is an amazing machine, but it has specific vulnerabilities and limitations. Understanding those vulnerabilities in both yourself and potential attackers is fundamental to effective self-defense. For the next hour, Sarah guided Mia through a series of exercises designed to demonstrate leverage, balance, and anatomical weak points. They practiced simple escapes from wrist grabs, showing how proper technique could overcome significant strength advantages. Mia learned to identify the pressure points that Sarah had used so effectively the previous night, though she was nowhere near capable of applying them with the precision and timing that made them effective weapons. The key, Sarah explained as Mia struggled to execute a basic hip throw on a practice dummy, is that technique multiplies strength rather than replacing it. A 125-pound woman using proper leverage can throw a 200-pound man, but only if she understands the physics involved. Mia's attempts were clumsy and ineffective, but Sarah's coaching was patient and methodical. She broke down each movement into component parts, identifying specific errors and providing corrections that gradually improved Mia's performance. There was no frustration or impatience in her instruction, just the steady persistence of someone who'd taught these skills to countless students under far more stressful conditions. This is harder than it looks, Mia gasped after her 15th failed attempt at a simple arm drag technique. Everything worth learning is harder than it looks, Sarah replied. But you're making progress. Your footwork is improving and you're starting to understand how to use your hips for power generation. In 6 months, these movements will feel natural. The mention of a 6-month timeline made Mia pause. You're planning to be here for 6 months? Sarah's expression became carefully neutral. I'm on extended leave from active duty. The Navy wants me to take time to process some recent experiences before returning to operational status. She adjusted the position of a training dummy with unnecessary precision. Teaching you gives me something productive to focus on while I work through those issues. There was clearly more to the story, but Mia recognized that pushing for details would be inappropriate. Instead, she focused on the opportunities she was being offered. A professional warrior was willing to share knowledge that most people would never have access to, and the only price was her willingness to work harder than she'd ever worked at anything. What happened to your previous students? Mia asked as they moved to practicing basic defensive stances. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily on the equipment she was adjusting. Some of them graduated to become instructors themselves. Others are still serving in various capacities around the world. Her voice dropped almost imperceptibly. And some of them didn't make it home from their deployments. The weight of that statement settled over the training area like a heavy blanket. These weren't abstract skills that Sarah was teaching. They were tools that real people had used in real situations with life or death consequences. Some of those people had survived because of their training. Others had not, despite being among the most elite warriors in the world. "I'm sorry," Mia said quietly, recognizing grief when she saw it. Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. Instead, she redirected attention back to training. "Let's work on escape techniques. The goal is never to win a fight. It's to create an opportunity to get away safely. Remember, the best fight is the one you don't have." They practiced various scenarios: escaping from rear bear hugs, breaking free from front chokes, defending against pushes and shoves. Each technique built on the previous one, creating a foundation of skills that could be combined and adapted as situations demanded. Mia's movements were still awkward and hesitant, but she was beginning to understand the underlying principles. As the training session wound down, Sarah introduced one final concept that would prove crucial in the weeks to come. "Physical techniques are only part of the equation," she explained. "The most important weapon you have is your mindset. Predators rely on their victims accepting victimhood. The moment you decide to fight back, really fight back, not just resist, everything changes." She demonstrated this concept by having Mia practice what she called aggressive defense. Instead of just trying to escape from simulated attacks, Mia learned to immediately counterattack while creating distance. The exercises were basic, but they introduced a fundamentally different approach to conflict than anything Mia had ever considered. "I never thought of myself as someone who could hurt another person," Mia admitted as they cleaned up the training area. "Violence isn't about wanting to hurt people," Sarah replied. "It's about being willing to do whatever is necessary to protect yourself and others. There's a difference between aggression and appropriate force in response to genuine threats." As they prepared to leave, Sarah handed Mia a small notebook. "I want you to start keeping an awareness journal. Every day, write down 3 things you noticed about your environment that you might have missed before. Could be anything: suspicious behavior, escape routes, people who seemed out of place. The goal is to develop the habit of active observation." Walking to the parking lot, Mia felt energized despite her physical exhaustion. Her body ached in places she'd never known could ache, but her mind was sharp with the excitement of learning skills she'd never imagined possessing. For the first time in her adult life, she was beginning to understand what it might feel like to be truly confident rather than just hoping everything would work out. "Same time tomorrow?" Sarah asked as they reached their vehicles. "Absolutely," Mia replied without hesitation. "And Sarah, thank you for this. I know I'm probably not the most promising student you've ever had, but I'm committed to learning whatever you're willing to teach." Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from intimidating to warmly human. "You're more promising than you know. See you tomorrow." 3 weeks into their training regimen, Mia had developed calluses on her hands that she wore like badges of honor, and her awareness journal had grown from tentative observations to detailed tactical assessments of her daily environment. The transformation wasn't just physical, though her reflexes had sharpened considerably, and her confidence in moving through space had improved dramatically, but mental. She found herself automatically cataloging exit routes in restaurants, noting suspicious behavior patterns on public transportation, and positioning herself strategically in crowded spaces without conscious thought. Sarah had structured their training sessions with military precision, each night building methodically on previous lessons. They'd progressed from basic escape techniques to more advanced defensive combinations, incorporating elements of Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and combat techniques that Sarah had learned during her special operations training. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Sarah had decided it was time to share the story that had brought her to Riverstone, Colorado, and explain why teaching Mia had become more than just a way to pass time during her mandated leave. The functional training area had become their private domain, transformed each evening into a laboratory for learning violence and surviving it. Sarah had even convinced Gary to let them install additional mirrors and a heavy bag, ostensibly for general gym use, but primarily to support their specialized training requirements. The space felt different now, charged with the energy of serious work being accomplished. Mia arrived that evening to find Sarah sitting on a bench in the center of the training area, staring at something in her hands. As she approached, Mia could see it was a photograph, a group shot of military personnel in desert camouflage, their faces weathered by sun and stress, but their expressions confident and professional. "My team," Sarah said without looking up. "Operation Neptune's Trident 6 months ago. Classified mission in the South China Sea." Her voice carried a weight that Mia had never heard before, the particular gravity that comes with discussing the dead. "Lieutenant Commander James Torres, my second in command. Petty Officer First Class Amanda Thompson, our communications specialist. Both of them should be here right now, training new operators and sharing war stories over beer." Mia settled beside Sarah on the bench, recognizing that this was a moment for listening rather than speaking. In the 3 weeks they'd been training together, Sarah had shared technical knowledge, tactical wisdom, and professional experiences, but she'd never revealed anything personal about her motivations or the circumstances that had brought her to this small Colorado town. "The mission was supposed to be routine intelligence gathering," Sarah continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph with unconscious reverence. "Infiltrate a suspected weapons trafficking operation, document their activities, extract without engagement. Clean and simple, the kind of operation we'd done dozens of times before." She set the photo down carefully on the bench between them. But intelligence was wrong about the size of their security force, and what was supposed to be a 3-person surveillance team ended up in a firefight against 15 heavily armed hostiles. Sarah stood and moved to the heavy bag, her hands finding their way into the familiar rhythm of warming up before training. But her strikes lacked their usual precision, as if the memories were interfering with her muscle memory. Torres and Thompson both took hits in the initial contact. Torres had multiple chest wounds but was still functional. Thompson took shrapnel to her leg and couldn't move under her own power. We were pinned down in a warehouse with no extraction route and hostile reinforcements arriving every few minutes. Mia watched Sarah work the heavy bag with increasing intensity, each punch seeming to carry emotional weight rather than just physical force. The story was clearly difficult to tell, but Mia sensed that Sarah needed to share it as much as Mia needed to hear it. Standard protocol in that situation is to call for extraction and hold position until support arrives, Sarah said, her breathing becoming more labored as she increased the power of her strikes. But our communications equipment was damaged in the initial engagement, and Thompson was losing blood faster than our medical supplies could handle. We had maybe 20 minutes before she went into shock, and extraction was at least an hour away. Sarah stopped hitting the bag and turned to face Mia directly, her gray eyes reflecting the fluorescent lighting like storm clouds. So I made a command decision. Torres and I would fight our way out, carrying Thompson between us, and improvise an extraction route to the nearest safe zone. It wasn't by the book, it wasn't tactically sound, and it wasn't what any rational commander would have ordered, but it was the only option that might save all three of us. The silence in the gym stretched for several seconds, broken only by the humming of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. Mia could sense that they were approaching the heart of Sarah's story, the moment that had changed everything and brought her to this point. For the first 10 minutes, the plan worked perfectly, Sarah resumed, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We fought through 2 defensive positions, Torres covering our advance, while I carried Thompson. She was conscious and alert, giving us tactical updates on enemy movements even while bleeding out. We were maybe 200 meters from the extraction point when Torres took another hit. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her entire body radiating the tension of reliving traumatic memories. Sniper round to the head, killed instantly. 1 second he was laying down suppressing fire, the next second he was gone. And suddenly it was just me and Thompson, with hostile forces converging on our position from 3 directions. Mia felt her own chest tighten with sympathetic anxiety. Even knowing that Sarah had obviously survived the encounter, the tension of the story was almost unbearable. She could only imagine what it must have been like to live through it. I had a choice, Sarah said, beginning to pace around the training area like a caged predator. Abandon Thompson and escape on my own, guaranteeing my survival but leaving her to be captured or killed. Or stay with her and fight, probably getting us both killed but giving her a chance at survival. She stopped pacing and looked directly at Mia. According to my training, according to military doctrine, according to every rational calculation of risk and benefit, I should have left her. But you didn't, Mia said quietly, though it came out as more of a question than a statement. Sarah's smile was bitter and self-recriminating. No, I didn't. I carried Thompson the last 200 meters under fire, took 3 hits myself in the process, and somehow managed to reach the extraction point just as our backup arrived. Thompson lived. I lived. Torres came home in a flag-draped coffin because I made an emotional decision instead of a tactical one. The revelation hung in the air between them like an accusation. Sarah had saved one teammate but lost another, and she was clearly carrying the weight of that impossible choice like a physical burden. Mia began to understand why a decorated Navy SEAL might need psychological counseling and extended leave from active duty. The Navy gave me a commendation for heroism under fire, Sarah continued, her voice heavy with irony. Medal ceremony, press coverage, promotion recommendations. Everyone called me a hero for saving Thompson's life. She picked up the photograph again, staring at Torres's face with obvious pain. But Torres died because I refused to follow protocol, because I let emotion override tactical judgment, because I couldn't accept that sometimes you have to sacrifice one person to save another. Mia struggled to find appropriate words for such a profound revelation. The woman who had seemed invincible just a few weeks ago was revealing herself to be deeply human, scarred by choices that had no perfect answers and haunted by the consequences of doing what she thought was right. Is that why you're teaching me? Mia asked carefully. Because you need to save someone to make up for losing Torres? Sarah considered the question seriously before responding. Partly, maybe, but also because teaching you reminds me that skills and knowledge only have meaning when they're passed on. Torres and Thompson trained dozens of operators during their careers. Those people are still out there, still serving, still using what they learned. That's a kind of immortality that medals and commendations can't provide. She moved to the whiteboard and began outlining the evening's training agenda, her movements gradually returning to their usual precision as she focused on technical matters rather than emotional ones. Tonight, we're going to work on situational scenarios. I'm going to create realistic situations where you have to apply everything you've learned under pressure. No more isolated techniques. Now we test whether you can integrate your skills when adrenaline is pumping and time is limited. The transition from profound personal revelation to practical training felt jarring, but Mia recognized it as Sarah's way of processing difficult emotions. Work was therapy, technique was meditation, and teaching was a form of healing that benefited both instructor and student. "Before we start," Mia said, standing to join Sarah at the whiteboard, "I want you to know that I understand why you made the choice you did, and I think Torres would understand too. You saved someone who couldn't save herself, even when it meant accepting higher risk for both of you. That's not poor judgment, that's courage." Sarah's hand stilled on the whiteboard marker, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that, even if I'm not sure I believe it yet." As they began that evening's training, both women carried a deeper understanding of what they were building together. For Mia, it was empowerment and capability. For Sarah, it was redemption and purpose. And for both of them, it was the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond the confines of their nightly training sessions. 6 weeks into their training partnership, Mia had developed the kind of situational awareness that made her co-workers at Mountain Tech Solutions wonder why she'd started choosing seats with her back to the wall, and why she always knew exactly who was entering and leaving their open concept office. Her reflexes had sharpened to the point where she'd startled 3 different colleagues by automatically blocking what they'd intended as friendly shoulder taps. But more significantly, she'd begun to carry herself differently, spine straighter, movements more purposeful, eye contact more direct and sustained. Sarah had noticed these changes with professional satisfaction, recognizing the transformation from potential victim to capable defender. But she'd also observed something else. Mia was developing the kind of confidence that could become overconfidence if not properly managed. Tonight's training session would address that dangerous evolution by introducing scenarios designed to humble and educate rather than simply build skills. The functional training area had been reconfigured once again, this time to simulate real-world environments where conflicts typically occurred. Sarah had arranged equipment to create narrow corridors, blind corners, and confined spaces that would limit Mia's movement options and force her to adapt her techniques to realistic constraints. A large mirror had been positioned to create the illusion of additional space while actually restricting maneuverability, a psychological test as much as a physical one. "Tonight, we're going to simulate multiple attackers," Sarah announced as Mia completed her warm-up routine. "Everything you've learned so far has been one-on-one scenarios, but real predators often work in groups. The tactics and psychology are completely different when you're outnumbered." Mia felt a familiar flutter of nervous energy, but it was different now. Anticipation rather than fear. 6 weeks of training had given her a foundation of techniques and the confidence to apply them under controlled circumstances. She was eager to test herself against more challenging scenarios. Sarah had recruited 2 additional training partners for the evening. Marcus Chen, a former Army Ranger who worked as a personal trainer at the gym, and Detective Lisa Warren from the Riverstone Police Department, who taught women's self-defense classes in her spare time. Both were experienced martial artists who could provide realistic resistance while maintaining the safety protocols necessary for advanced training. The fundamental rule of multiple attacker scenarios, Sarah explained as Marcus and Lisa took their positions around the training area, is that everything you think you know about fighting changes. Individual techniques become less important than movement, positioning, and tactical decision-making. Your goal is never to defeat multiple opponents. It's to create an escape opportunity while minimizing damage to yourself. Mia nodded, feeling confident in her preparation. She'd mastered the individual techniques Sarah had taught her, proven herself capable of executing them under pressure, and developed the kind of tactical thinking that allowed her to analyze situations rather than just react to them. How different could multiple opponents really be? The first scenario began simply enough. Marcus approached from the front while Lisa circled to Mia's left side, moving slowly to give her time to recognize the threat pattern and formulate a response. Mia successfully defended against Marcus's initial grab attempt, using a wrist control technique to redirect his momentum while simultaneously creating distance from Lisa's flanking approach. "Good awareness," Sarah called out, "but don't get locked into engaging the first attacker. Your priority is maintaining mobility." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The second scenario increased the pressure. Marcus and Lisa approached simultaneously from different angles, forcing Mia to make split-second decisions about which threat to address first and how to prevent herself from being trapped between them. She managed the initial contact well, but her movement became increasingly frantic as she tried to maintain distance from both opponents while looking for an escape route. "You're starting to panic," Sarah observed. "When your breathing becomes irregular, your decision-making deteriorates. Control your breathing and your tactical choices will improve." The third scenario was where Mia's confidence began to crumble. Marcus, Lisa, and Sarah herself approached from 3 different directions, moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd worked together before. Mia found herself overwhelmed almost immediately, her carefully practiced techniques failing under the pressure of multiple simultaneous threats. She attempted to apply a hip throw against Marcus, but Lisa's presence on her flank prevented her from committing fully to the technique. When she tried to create distance with a palm strike, Sarah was already moving to cut off her escape route. Within 30 seconds, all 3 training partners had her surrounded with no viable exit options. "Stop," Sarah called, and everyone froze in position. "Mia, what went wrong?" Mia's face was flushed with exertion and frustration. "I couldn't focus on any one technique long enough to make it work. Every time I started to engage one person, the others were moving to trap me." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "You were trying to fight 3 people instead of trying to escape from 3 people. Against multiple opponents, your individual techniques are almost irrelevant. What matters is understanding group dynamics and exploiting the psychological factors that make coordination difficult." She gestured for Marcus and Lisa to reset their positions. Multiple attackers typically designate one person as the primary aggressor, while the others provide support and prevent escape. If you can identify and neutralize the leader quickly and dramatically, you can often cause the others to hesitate long enough for you to create an escape opportunity. The fourth scenario tested this principle. Sarah designated Marcus as the primary aggressor and instructed Lisa to play a more passive support role. When Marcus approached, Mia abandoned her attempt to use defensive techniques and instead launched an immediate counterattack, striking his nose with a palm heel strike that was more aggressive than anything she'd previously attempted in training. The simulated violence shocked her with its effectiveness. Marcus recoiled immediately, and Lisa's advance stalled as her brain processed the unexpected level of aggression from someone she'd been thinking of as a victim rather than a threat. In that moment of hesitation, Mia broke through their formation and reached the designated safe zone. "Outstanding," Sarah said, but her tone carried a warning. "You successfully disrupted their coordination and created an escape opportunity, but you also crossed a line from defensive action to aggressive assault. In a real situation, that distinction could have legal implications. The observation hit Mia like a physical blow. In her focus on executing the technique successfully, she'd forgotten about the broader context of justified force and proportional response. The palm strike to Marcus's nose had been delivered with real intent to cause pain and disorientation, not just to demonstrate technique. "I'm sorry," she said to Marcus, who was checking his nose for actual damage. "I didn't mean to hit you that hard." Marcus grinned and waved off her concern. "You barely connected, but the intent was there, and that's what created the psychological effect. Sarah's right, though. You need to understand the difference between appropriate force and excessive force." Detective Warren stepped forward to address this crucial point. "In Colorado, you have the legal right to defend yourself with reasonable force when facing imminent threat of bodily harm. But reasonable force is determined by the courts based on the totality of circumstances. What seems reasonable in the moment might look excessive to a jury reviewing security footage." The legal discussion continued for 20 minutes, covering topics that civilian self-defense classes typically ignored: duty to retreat, escalation of force, witness statements, police interviews, and the difference between criminal and civil liability. Mia realized that learning to fight effectively was only part of the equation. She also needed to understand when fighting was legally and morally justified. "This is much more complicated than I thought," Mia admitted as they prepared for additional scenarios. "I always assumed that if someone attacked me, I could do whatever was necessary to stop them." "That's a dangerous assumption," Sarah replied. "Force decisions have to be made in fractions of a second, but they're evaluated by people who have unlimited time to analyze every detail. You need to understand those standards before you find yourself in a situation where you have to apply them." The final scenario of the evening was designed to test Mia's judgment rather than just her physical skills. Marcus and Lisa approached her in a crowded environment simulation, using verbal intimidation and aggressive body language, but stopping short of actual physical contact. Their behavior was clearly threatening, but not obviously illegal. Mia found herself paralyzed by uncertainty. Her training had prepared her to respond to physical attacks, but this situation existed in the gray area between legal harassment and criminal assault. Should she wait for them to make physical contact before responding? Should she attempt to de-escalate verbally? Should she create distance and seek help from authorities? "This is the hardest scenario," Sarah explained after calling a halt to the exercise. "Clear-cut attacks are actually rare. Most real situations involve ambiguous behavior that could be interpreted multiple ways. Your judgment about when to transition from avoidance to defensive action often matters more than your physical techniques." As they cleaned up the training area, Sarah made one final observation that would prove prophetic in the weeks to come. "You've developed impressive skills over the past 6 weeks. Your techniques are solid, your awareness has improved dramatically, and you're beginning to think tactically rather than just reactively. But success in training scenarios doesn't automatically translate to success in real situations." She paused in her equipment organization to look directly at Mia. The most dangerous phase of training is when students become confident in their abilities, but haven't yet been tested under genuine stress. Confidence without experience can lead to poor judgment and unnecessary confrontations. Mia nodded, but part of her wondered if Sarah was being overly cautious. After 6 weeks of intensive training, she felt more capable and confident than she'd ever imagined possible. The woman who'd been cornered and intimidated by 5 gym bullies seemed like a different person from a different lifetime. That confidence would be tested sooner than either of them expected. 2 weeks after the multiple attacker training session, Mia's world shifted in ways that had nothing to do with physical combat, but everything to do with the psychological warfare that often preceded it. The transformation began subtly, a feeling of being watched during her morning coffee runs, shadows that seemed to follow her movements through the parking garage at Mountain Tech Solutions, phone calls that disconnected immediately when she answered. At first, she attributed these incidents to paranoia brought on by her intensive self-defense training, but Sarah had taught her to trust her instincts rather than rationalize away potential threats. The escalation came on a Thursday evening as Mia was leaving work later than usual, having stayed behind to debug a critical software issue that had crashed their client management system. The Mountain Tech building was mostly empty by 8 p.m., with only security lights illuminating the underground parking garage where she'd left her Honda Civic that morning. As she approached her vehicle, her newly developed situational awareness immediately identified multiple anomalies that set off every alarm bell Sarah had taught her to recognize. Her car sat lower than it should, suggesting slashed tires. The overhead lighting in her section of the garage had been disabled, creating a pool of darkness around her vehicle. Most significantly, she could hear the subtle sounds of movement from behind the concrete support pillars that flanked her parking space, the kind of deliberate positioning that indicated coordinated surveillance rather than coincidental presence. Derek Vaughn emerged from behind the pillar to her left, his face carrying the cold satisfaction of someone who'd been planning revenge for weeks. He was flanked by Jake Morrison and a new face, a heavily muscled man in his 30s who carried himself with the casual menace of someone comfortable with violence. Troy Blackstone and Ryan Cross appeared from behind other pillars, completing a formation that effectively trapped her in the parking space with no clear escape route. "Well, well," Derek said, his voice echoing strangely in the concrete space. "Look who's been playing soldier girl with her crazy friend. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences for what happened at the gym?" Mia's training took over automatically, her brain shifting into the tactical analysis mode that Sarah had drilled into her through countless scenarios. 5 opponents in a confined space with limited escape routes and no immediate access to help or witnesses. Her car was disabled, her phone showed no signal in the underground garage, and the nearest security camera was positioned too far away to capture useful footage of what was about to happen. But instead of the paralyzing fear that would have overwhelmed her 2 months ago, Mia felt the strange calm that came with having prepared for exactly this situation. Sarah's voice echoed in her mind. "Against multiple opponents, your goal is never to win. It's to create an escape opportunity while minimizing damage to yourself." "Derek, this is not going to end the way you think it is," Mia said, keeping her voice steady while simultaneously calculating distances and positioning. The new face worried her most. He moved with a predatory confidence that suggested actual combat experience rather than just gym intimidation tactics. Jake Morrison laughed, the sound brittle and nervous. "Oh, this is going to be even better than we planned. Princess thinks her little karate lessons are going to help her against 5 guys. This isn't your controlled training environment, sweetheart. This is real life." The unknown man stepped forward, and Mia immediately recognized the difference between him and Derek's usual crew. Where the others postured and threatened, he moved with economical precision, his eyes constantly tracking her positioning and potential responses. This wasn't just another gym bully. This was someone who understood violence as a tool rather than just an expression of anger. "Marcus Brennan," he introduced himself with mock politeness. "Derek's been telling me about his problem with you and your military girlfriend. I specialize in solving problems that regular people can't handle." His smile was coldly professional. I understand you've been learning some new skills. That's good. It'll make this more interesting. Sarah's warnings about overconfidence echoed in Mia's mind as she realized the full scope of what she was facing. This wasn't going to be a replay of the gym confrontation, where she'd been rescued by superior intervention. This was a carefully planned ambush by people who'd had weeks to prepare, and she was going to have to rely entirely on her own skills and judgment to survive it. "What do you want?" she asked, though she suspected the answer wouldn't matter. This wasn't about extracting apologies or establishing dominance. This was about revenge, and people motivated by revenge rarely accepted reasonable alternatives. "What we want," Derek replied, his voice carrying years of accumulated resentment, "is for you to understand that actions have consequences. You humiliated us in front of half the gym with your little demonstration. You cost us our memberships and our reputation. You made us look weak." Troy Blackstone cracked his knuckles audibly. "So now we're going to show everyone what happens when you mess with us. And when we're done with you, we're going to pay a visit to your teacher and show her what real numbers look like." The threat against Sarah ignited something in Mia that surprised her with its intensity. For weeks she'd been training to defend herself, but the idea of these men targeting Sarah, someone who'd sacrificed her time and emotional energy to help a stranger, triggered a protective rage that she'd never experienced before. Marcus seemed to recognize the change in her demeanor, his posture shifting slightly as he reassessed the tactical situation. "Careful, gentlemen, our student is having an emotional reaction. That could make her unpredictable." But Mia wasn't becoming unpredictable. She was becoming focused. Sarah's training had included emotional regulation techniques designed to help operators function under extreme stress, and Mia found herself accessing that programming now. Her breathing became controlled and rhythmic. Her vision sharpened, and her awareness expanded to encompass every detail of the environment around her. The garage's layout suddenly revealed tactical opportunities she hadn't noticed in her initial assessment. The concrete pillars that trapped her also limited her attackers' ability to coordinate their approach. The disabled lighting created shadows that could be used for concealment as well as exposure. Most importantly, the narrow space between parked cars forced any assault to funnel through predictable approach routes. "Last chance to walk away," Mia said, though she knew they were far beyond the point where de-escalation was possible. "Call this off now, and nobody gets hurt." Derek's response was to gesture to his companions, who began closing the distance with the coordinated movement of people who'd planned their approach carefully. But their coordination was visual rather than tactical. They moved like a group that had rehearsed intimidation scenarios, but never actually fought together under pressure. Marcus hung back slightly, clearly intending to let the others engage first, while he observed and adapted his own approach based on how effectively she dealt with the initial assault. It was sound tactical thinking, but it also revealed that he considered her a genuine threat rather than just a victim to be processed. The first contact came from Jake Morrison, who rushed forward with the uncontrolled aggression of someone trying to overwhelm opposition through sheer momentum. Mia sidestepped his charge, used his forward motion to execute a hip throw that sent him crashing into the side of her disabled car, then immediately pivoted to address Troy's simultaneous approach from her right flank. Her training took over completely, muscle memory and tactical thinking merging into fluid responses that surprised her with their effectiveness. Troy's attempt to grab her from the side met with a precise elbow strike to his solar plexus, followed by a sweep that dropped him to the concrete floor of the garage. But even as she successfully defended against the first two attacks, Mia could see the tactical picture deteriorating. Ryan Cross was moving to cut off her retreat route, while Derek circled to attack from behind. Marcus continued to observe, clearly waiting for her to become engaged with multiple opponents before committing himself to the fight. This was exactly the scenario Sarah had warned her about, the moment when initial success against untrained opponents could lead to overconfidence and tactical mistakes that would prove fatal against more dangerous adversaries. Mia had neutralized 2 attackers, but she was still outnumbered 3-1 with the most dangerous opponent yet to engage. The next 60 seconds would determine whether 8 weeks of intensive training had prepared her for real-world violence, or whether she was about to learn the difference between controlled sparring and life-or-death combat the hardest way possible. Ryan Cross moved to flank Mia's position just as Derek began his approach. From behind, their timing coordinated but not perfect, a gap that Sarah's training had taught her to recognize and exploit. Instead of trying to defend against multiple simultaneous attacks, Mia made the tactical decision that would define the next critical moments of the confrontation. She charged directly at Ryan, closing distance before he could set his stance, and drove her knee into his midsection with enough force to double him over and eliminate him as an immediate threat. The aggressive movement caught Derek off guard, forcing him to adjust his approach angle and buying Mia precious seconds to reposition herself. She used Ryan's bent form as a partial shield while pivoting to face Derek's charge, then sidestepped and grabbed his extended arm, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the concrete pillar with a sound that echoed through the parking garage like a gunshot. 3 attackers down, but Marcus Brennan was finally moving, and his approach demonstrated the difference between amateur thugs and someone who understood combat as a professional discipline. He didn't rush or telegraph his intentions. Instead, he advanced with the patient deliberation of someone who'd been studying her techniques and timing throughout the encounter. "Impressive," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine professional appreciation rather than mockery. "Your instructor taught you well, but let's see how you handle someone who's had the same training she has." The statement hit Mia like a physical blow, suddenly recontextualizing everything about this encounter. Marcus wasn't just another gym thug Derek had recruited for intimidation. He was someone with legitimate combat training who'd been brought specifically to counter the advantages Sarah had given her. This wasn't an ambush by angry bullies. It was a planned operation designed to neutralize her specific capabilities. Marcus's first attack confirmed her worst fears. His approach was textbook military combatives, a precise combination of strikes designed to overwhelm her defensive capabilities while maintaining his own tactical positioning. Where Derek and his crew had relied on size and aggression, Marcus fought with the economical efficiency of someone who'd learned violence as a tool rather than an expression of emotion. Mia found herself immediately on the defensive, her carefully learned techniques struggling to counter someone who understood the same tactical principles Sarah had taught her. Marcus's strikes were aimed at nerve clusters and pressure points, his footwork designed to limit her mobility options, his timing calibrated to disrupt her breathing and balance. Within 30 seconds, she was bleeding from a cut above her left eye and struggling to maintain distance from an opponent who seemed to anticipate her responses. But 8 weeks of intensive training with a Navy SEAL had given Mia more than just physical techniques. It had taught her to think under pressure, to analyze tactical situations even while fighting for her life, and to recognize when established plans weren't working. As Marcus pressed his attack, she realized that trying to match his technical skills was a losing proposition. Instead, she needed to change the nature of the engagement entirely. The opportunity came when Marcus committed to a combination that would have been devastatingly effective in a controlled training environment. But the parking garage wasn't a padded dojo, and Mia had advantages that didn't exist in formal sparring scenarios. As he moved to execute what would have been a takedown against an opponent focused solely on hand-to-hand combat, Mia grabbed a handful of gravel from the garage floor and threw it directly into his eyes. The improvised technique wasn't something Sarah had taught her specifically, but it embodied the fundamental principle that had underlain all their training. Survival was more important than technique, and anything that worked was legitimate in a life-or-death situation. Marcus's reaction was automatic and predictable. He raised his hands to clear his vision, creating the opening Mia needed to escape his engagement zone. But instead of trying to flee, Mia made a decision that surprised even herself. She grabbed a tire iron from the trunk of a nearby damaged car and turned to face Marcus as he wiped gravel from his eyes. The improvised weapon changed the tactical equation completely, giving her reach and impact advantages that his superior training couldn't easily counter. "Now we're even," she said, her voice carrying a confidence that she felt rather than projected. 8 weeks ago, she would never have imagined herself armed and ready to fight a trained combatant in a parking garage. But Sarah's training had given her more than defensive techniques. It had taught her that she was capable of far more than she'd ever believed possible. Marcus's expression shifted as he reassessed the tactical situation. The tire iron in Mia's hands represented a significant escalation of force, one that moved the encounter from assault toward potential deadly force scenarios. His professional training included de-escalation protocols for exactly these situations, where continuation of violence carried unacceptable legal and physical risks. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone trying to prevent a situation from spiraling beyond control. "Assault with a weapon carries serious felony charges. Walk away now, and this stays at the misdemeanor level." But Mia had moved beyond legal calculations into the primitive survival mindset that Sarah had identified as the ultimate foundation of effective self-defense. She wasn't thinking about legal consequences or proportional response. She was focused solely on eliminating a threat to her safety and preventing these men from carrying out their promised attack on Sarah. "You had your chance to walk away," she replied, adjusting her grip on the tire iron with movements that demonstrated the mechanical precision Sarah's training had instilled. "Now you get to explain to Derek why his revenge plan turned into a disaster." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension like a blade, distant but growing rapidly closer. Someone had apparently heard the commotion and contacted police, creating a new tactical variable that changed everyone's calculations about continuing the confrontation. Marcus immediately stepped back, his hands visible and his posture shifting to non-threatening positioning. Whatever his background and training, he clearly understood the legal implications of being found at a crime scene with multiple casualties and weapons present. "This isn't over," he said, but his tone carried professional respect rather than personal animosity. "Your instructor taught you well, better than I expected." Derek and his remaining conscious companions were already moving toward the garage exit, their enthusiasm for revenge significantly diminished by the unexpected resistance they'd encountered and the approaching sounds of law enforcement. Jake Morrison limped away from where he'd crashed into Mia's car, while Troy struggled to regain his footing after the elbow strike to his solar plexus. As the parking garage emptied of attackers, Mia found herself alone with the aftermath of her first real combat experience. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline, her clothes were torn and dirty, and she was bleeding from multiple minor injuries. But she was alive, undefeated, and standing on her own feet through her own capabilities. The police sirens were getting closer, and she would soon need to provide statements and explanations for what had happened in this concrete tomb. But in this moment, she felt something she'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she could protect herself and others when the situation demanded it. Sarah's training had given her more than just fighting techniques. It had given her the knowledge that she was not a victim, had never been a victim, and would never be a victim again. That transformation was worth every hour of pain, every moment of doubt, and every drop of blood she'd shed to achieve it. The real test was over. Everything else was just paperwork. 6 months later, Mia Rodriguez stood in the same functional training area where her transformation had begun, but now she occupied a fundamentally different role. Instead of being the anxious student struggling with basic defensive techniques, she had become an assistant instructor, helping Sarah guide a new group of women through their own journeys, from vulnerability to empowerment. The irony wasn't lost on her that the space where she'd once felt so inadequate had become the place where she felt most capable and confident. The evening's training session involved 12 women ranging in age, from 19 to 54, each carrying their own stories of harassment, intimidation, or assault that had brought them to seek the kind of education that Sarah provided. There was Jennifer Chen, a college student who'd been followed home from campus multiple times. Maria Santos, a single mother whose ex-husband had violated restraining orders. Rebecca Walsh, a nurse who'd been groped by patients and needed tools to defend herself professionally, and 9 others whose experiences formed a depressing catalog of the various ways society failed to protect women from predatory behavior. Sarah had formalized her training program after the parking garage incident, creating what she called the Phoenix Academy, a reference both to her military call sign and to the concept of rising from the ashes of victimhood into something stronger. The curriculum she'd developed drew from her special operations background but adapted the techniques and psychological components specifically for civilian women facing real-world threats rather than military combat scenarios. The legal aftermath of Derek's revenge attempt had actually strengthened the program's credibility rather than undermining it. Detective Lisa Warren's investigation had revealed that Derek and Marcus had planned their assault meticulously, including surveillance of Mia's daily routines and coordination with other gym members who felt humiliated by the original confrontation. The multiple felony charges that resulted, assault, conspiracy, stalking, and weapons violations, had sent a clear message about the consequences of targeting women who fought back. Marcus Brennan's background check had revealed he was a dishonorably discharged Marine whose combat training had been compromised by alcohol problems and anger management issues. His professional approach to violence, which had initially seemed so intimidating, was actually the product of incomplete military training combined with civilian criminal activity. Sarah's assessment after reviewing his case files was brutally direct. He had enough training to be dangerous, but not enough discipline to be effective. Exactly the kind of half-trained predator that women need to be prepared for. Tonight's lesson focused on psychological preparation for violence, the mental component that Sarah considered more crucial than any physical technique. The 12 students sat in a circle as she explained concepts that civilian self-defense courses rarely addressed: the physiological effects of adrenaline, the importance of controlled aggression, and the difference between being prepared for violence and seeking it. The goal, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd tested these concepts, under the most extreme circumstances possible, is never to become someone who looks for fights. The goal is to become someone who can win fights when they're unavoidable. That distinction matters more than any specific technique you'll learn. Mia watched the faces of the students as they processed Sarah's words, recognizing the mixture of fear and determination that she'd felt during her own early training sessions. But she also noticed something different in this group. They came to training with the knowledge that Sarah's methods worked, that transformation was possible, and that the women who completed the program emerged fundamentally changed. The Phoenix Academy had gained national attention after a documentary filmmaker had learned about Sarah's work and produced a short film about women's self-defense that featured Mia's story prominently. The film, titled Rising, had won awards at several film festivals and generated inquiries from women across the country who wanted access to similar training. Sarah had been overwhelmed by the response, leading to her decision to formalize the curriculum and train additional instructors who could replicate her methods in other locations. "Mia," Sarah said, gesturing for her to join the circle, "is going to share something with you that I think will help you understand what this training can actually accomplish. Not the techniques, you'll learn those over time, but the psychological transformation that makes everything else possible." Mia had told her story dozens of times over the past 6 months, but it never became routine. Each telling forced her to remember not just what had happened, but who she'd been before Sarah's intervention and how fundamentally that person had changed. The woman who'd been cornered and intimidated in a gym seemed like someone she'd known in a previous lifetime rather than her earlier self. "6 months ago," she began, making eye contact with each student in turn, "I was exactly where most of you are now. I'd accepted being a victim as a permanent part of my identity. When men like Derek and his friends targeted me, I assumed it was something I had to endure because I didn't have alternatives." She paused, remembering the parking garage confrontation and the moment when she'd realized she could fight back effectively. "But Sarah taught me something that changed everything. She taught me that being a victim is a circumstance, not an identity. Circumstances can be changed if you're willing to do the work." Jennifer Chen raised her hand tentatively. "But what if we're not naturally aggressive people? What if the idea of hurting someone else, even in self-defense, feels wrong?" The question struck to the heart of what Mia considered the most important lesson she'd learned. "I'm not naturally aggressive either," she replied. "I still don't enjoy violence or look for confrontations, but I've learned that protecting yourself and others isn't about aggression. It's about refusing to accept victimization as inevitable." Sarah stepped forward to address the broader implications of Jennifer's question. "Moral people struggle with the ethics of violence, and that's appropriate. But predators count on that moral hesitation to paralyze their victims when decisive action is necessary. Part of our training involves resolving that moral conflict before you encounter a life-threatening situation." The discussion that followed covered territory that traditional self-defense classes avoided entirely: the psychology of justified force, the legal framework that governs self-defense decisions, and the emotional aftermath of successfully defending yourself against attackers. These weren't abstract concepts for Sarah and Mia. They were lessons learned through direct experience and refined through months of reflection. As the evening's formal instruction concluded, several students approached Mia privately to ask questions that they hadn't felt comfortable raising in the group setting. The conversations were always similar. Women who'd spent years accepting harassment and intimidation, suddenly glimpsing the possibility that they could refuse to tolerate such treatment. The hardest part, Mia explained to Maria Santos, whose ex-husband had escalated from verbal threats to property destruction despite court orders, isn't learning the physical techniques. It's accepting that you have the right to defend yourself, even against people who think they have authority over you. The transformation that Sarah had worked in Mia was now being replicated in a dozen other women, each discovering that the limitations they'd accepted as permanent were actually choices that could be changed through knowledge, training, and commitment. The ripple effect extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Their increased confidence and capabilities influenced their relationships, their professional lives, and their willingness to support other women facing similar challenges. As they cleaned up the training area, Sarah made an observation that had become her standard conclusion for new students. Physical techniques are just tools. What we're really teaching is the knowledge that you don't have to accept other people's decisions about your safety and dignity. That's a lesson that extends far beyond self-defense into every area of life. Driving home that night, Mia reflected on the journey that had brought her from scared software engineer to confident instructor. The woman who'd been cornered by 5 bullies in a gym had become someone who taught other women they didn't have to be cornered by anyone. The skills Sarah had shared weren't just about fighting, they were about refusing to accept powerlessness as a permanent condition. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Excellent work tonight. Your teaching skills are developing as impressively as your combat skills did. Same time tomorrow?" Mia's response was immediate and certain. "Absolutely, we have work to do." 6 months ago, that work had been about saving herself. Now it was about teaching other women they could save themselves. The transformation was complete, but the mission was just beginning. In training facilities across the country, women were discovering what Mia had learned in that parking garage confrontation. They were stronger than they knew, more capable than they'd imagined, and absolutely unwilling to be victims any longer. The Phoenix Academy's motto, embroidered on the patches students earned upon graduation, captured the essence of what Sarah and Mia were building together, from ashes to fire. It was more than just a reference to Sarah's military call sign. It was a promise that women who'd been burned by predatory behavior could rise from that experience as forces of nature that no one would ever underestimate again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.